American Senator Edward Kennedy has been laid to rest today after 3 days of mourning in his home city of Boston. And joining me now to talk about Teddy Kennedy's extraordinary life is Associate Professor Brendan O'Connor from the US Studies Centre at Sydney University. Professor O'Connor, thanks very much for coming in.
My pleasure.
Now, we've seen the pictures, we've seen the extraordinary ceremony really over, it's been 3 days of mourning and then the funeral service last night. President Obama spoke, you know, a lot of people have paid their respects. What have you taken from some of those speeches, the whole of the ceremony and the spectacle?
I think it's a remembrance of the Kennedy family. I mean, he was elected to the US Senate in 1963, so it's been an enormous career. He's someone who's filled a very large place in the American political life, and particularly after his two brothers were assassinated, I suppose he filled that gap that many people thought, what would have John F. Kennedy done or Bobby Kennedy have done if they'd still been around?
It is extraordinary, isn't it? Because he was supposed to be he was the youngest, and he was supposed to be perhaps the least focused on politics. And in the end, he stayed, 4 decades in the Senate. And so are you saying really that he carried on, in a strange sense, the work of what he thought his brothers might have done, even though he never got to be president? Very
much so. You saw, if anyone's seen the eulogy he gave at Robert Kennedy's funeral, there was a sense of this is a family that believes in certain social values, believes in hope, believes in civil rights reform, believes in helping the poor. And those were things that he championed with a very strong voice and a very long career with real serious activity in the Senate as a legislator.
Do you think that he really, his name is on so many pieces of legislation. Was he really the driving force for those pieces of legislation, or is it just that, he could push them to a certain degree and then other people take them on?
I think so. I think he was very active because he wasn't quite as good a speaker as John F. Kennedy or Robert Kennedy. He wasn't really the classic campaigner. He was actually really good at forming friendships. Within the Senate, many of the Republicans who spoke over the last few days have said they really liked his sense of humour, his sense of him as a man, I think. And this really helped in a Senate where it's quite technical and you need to be drawn into very long discussions and very patient. And he seemed to have that talent, which may surprise some with the story that were told about his character in the 1980s, where he got involved in a lot of partying and good times. But he was, I think, a real sort of consummate expert of the rules of the Senate and of the process of the Senate, which really made a big difference in his career.
So he was really more a backroom kind of guy, and in that way, I guess he was incredibly effective.
Yes, indeed. A parliamentarian, I suppose, to use a kind of British or Australian word, more so than someone who wasn't a classic speech maker in the Obama mode. He was never someone who spoke on his feet with real talent. He could deliver a great set speech because he had that sort of fire within his belly, but he wasn't someone who could speak day after day.
What was the importance of him endorsing Obama? Was it really the turning point for him to make it to the White House, do you think?
It was late January last year, and Hillary Clinton had won the primary in New Hampshire. People were probably starting to waver a little bit on Obama or say, well, has he really got the substance? And so I think it was very important, and I think they shared that opposition to the Iraq War, which was very important, I think, for Edward Kennedy.
That's right, to remind people that he was someone who voted against the Iraq War in the House,
which I think was one of his proudest votes in the Senate. So I think this brought them together, and it gave a bit of substance to him. Obama didn't win the primary, however, in Massachusetts, which was kind of interesting, given the endorsement of Kennedy, but he did well enough in the big primaries of Super Tuesday to really give the momentum to his campaign to beat Hillary Clinton.
Just briefly, it's not meant to be disrespectful on the day of his funeral, but the Chappaquiddick incident, everyone has talked about it, and he didn't really hide it either. He had to face it many, many years ago. How seriously do you think that has affected his life as a public figure, in that it really stopped him from getting to the presidency, didn't it?
Yes, indeed. He could have been a US president, and that was a major impediment. I don't think he was entirely truthful about what happened on that night. It was 9 hours between the time that the event occurred and when he reported it to authorities. So it was, I think, a serious demerit against him.
Yeah.
And a woman died on that night. So I don't think you can, I don't think you should push it to the side. It was a rather serious failing.
Yes, there was an interesting piece that Stephen Loosley, former Labor Senator, wrote in yesterday's Australian, the Weekend Australian, really talking about the two sides of him. One, he gave this incredibly impassioned speech against the appointment of Robert Bork, the Conservative, to the Supreme Court, and yet on another side, he really couldn't talk about the nomination of Clarence Thomas, who had been looked at for sexual harassment of women, and Ted Kennedy had to be mute on that.
The timing of that second nomination was very poor for Kennedy. There'd been those unfortunate events in Florida in 1991, so his own behaviour that I mentioned before in the 1980s was often portrayed in the tabloids as having a good time and a lot of drinks with younger women. So he was someone who couldn't play a massive role in that, you know, campaign against Clarence Thomas, where Robert Bork, it was much more on the issues, on social conservative issues, and Bork was very forcefully attacked by Kennedy, and some say that was the beginning of a very new partisan style in American politics, where judges or nominees could be attacked by the party that hadn't nominated them. And some people see that, particularly conservative Americans, as the beginning of a much nastier politics in Washington. Liberal Americans would see it as a great moment. They stopped this man, Robert Bork, coming into the Senate, coming into the Supreme Court.
His death now, is it really the end of the era of Camelot? It's the end of the three brothers, obviously. But are there there are so many grandchildren and nieces and nephews. Are they coming up in the ranks, very briefly?
Yeah, I mean, Robert Kennedy had 11 children, so the Kennedy name is not going to die, and I'm sure they'll want to serve the public. But that extraordinary drive which the three brothers had, that Joseph Kennedy gave them, I think it's hard to quite imagine that, and that kind of magic that the three of them had, and the combination of them, where I think people will talk about Kennedy's running at state level for a long time, but it's hard to envisage in the short term another one making it to the heights of those three brothers.
Professor Brendan O'Connor, thank you so much for joining us.
Not a problem.
Associate Professor Brendan O'Connor from the US Studies Centre at Sydney University. And that's all we have time